It is November 11th, 2009. We are at the Glenview Public Library interviewing Philip Dowd. He was born on November 28th, 1932. We are here with Phil Saylor, Annie Boswell, and Carrie Hansen doing the Veterans Oral History Project, part of the Korean War in the Navy branch, rose to the rank of Petty Officer, 3rd class, and served in the Pacific. Mr. Dowd, did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
What year was that?
1952.
Why did you decide to join?
Well, at that time, if you were a high school graduate, you either went in the Army or someplace else. During the Korean War, there weren't a lot of options, and I thought the Navy provided me with a greater opportunity to travel and do what I thought at that young age was important.
Where did you grow up?
Most of my growing up years were in Flint, Michigan. Lived in many towns, but most of my growing up years were in Flint.
Did many of your childhood friends or schoolmates join the Army like you did? Did the community influence your decision at all?
Not really. Most everybody who graduated from high school went in the service at that time.
Do you recall the day you enlisted or your first days of service, either in boot camp or training?
Oh, yes.
Would you like to elaborate on any stories that you have?
Well, we arrived at the Naval Training Center in North Chicago, and we arrived at night, and as I remember, we hadn't had much to eat, and so they stopped the train, it seemed like, in the middle of no place, and let us off, and then we went to a barracks, and we went to bed. That was my first day in the Navy.
Do you have any experiences from boot camp or training later in your training days?
After boot camp, I was assigned to in the boot camp they teach you how to be a seagoing sailor. And then I was in the aviation part of the Navy, so then they send you to an 8-week school to learn how to be an aviation-orientated person, to do the things that you have to do around airplanes. And then they sent me to a specialty school, aviation machinist mate school. And that took 6-7 months. So in my first part of the Navy, I was just going to school all the time.
Do you remember any specific instructions or things that have helped you after the service?
Things I learned in the service? One is, I think, I heard from a lot of older people that if you volunteer sometime, that's not necessarily good. In other words, it's better to be a fly on the wall and just take what comes. I found that wasn't very effective, and so I volunteered for a few things in the Navy that radically changed my experience for the better. And so I guess that's the biggest thing.
Where exactly did you go in the Pacific?
Well, you have a list of all the places, but once I was assigned to a squadron in what is now called Silicon Valley or whatever, Mountain View, California, Moffett Field, California. Once I was assigned there, after a week or two, I got on flight status and started making regular flights. Depending on, as a logistics squadron, we were similar to an airline, like United, etc. But it kind of the same but different. So anything that had to go any place in the Pacific or anywhere in what they call the Alaskan Sea Frontier, which is the Alaskan, Aleutian Islands, etc. Anything that had to go in that area in a hurry, they would come to Moffett Field and we would fly them. That's kind of the way it worked. So we had semi-scheduled flights to Hawaii, and then because of in those days we had propeller-driven airplanes, and it took a long time, like a 9-hour flight to go from San Francisco area to Hawaii. And so by the time you flew across the Pacific Ocean, flying from California to Hawaii to Kwajalein, Midway Island, Kwajalein, Guam. You know, we had to stop because the planes couldn't go that far without stopping for refueling, etc. So, and then I've been to the Philippines many times, in Japan many times. I made one trip to Fiji and to New Zealand. Admiral Byrd was going down to Antarctica, and he had a ship, and he was just 5 plane loads short of the material that he needed. So we flew 5 plane loads of supplies down to New Zealand, which was a very fun trip. I'd never been in the Southern Hemisphere before, so I enjoyed it. And the New Zealand people are so friendly and so kind and so patient with Yanks, as they call us. Some of the men in the Navy that are from the South part of the United States, they didn't know if they liked to be called Yanks. So, you know, up in this part of the country, it's not a big deal. If somebody called you a rebel, you know, what would you say? But to the New Zealanders, all Americans are Yanks.
Did you get to spend any time on any of the islands that you flew to, or was it strictly you fly, drop off, and then fly back?
I spent, this is a broad generalization, I spent every second weekend on Waikiki Beach for 3¼ years. They had a government facility there called Fort DeRussy, and it used to cost 75 cents a night to stay there. And that was, I don't know if you've ever been to Hawaii, but that's a block and a half from the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, where people at that time were paying $50, $60, $70, which was a lot of money in 1950. And once flying from Hawaii to Midway Island, we lost 2 engines out of 4. And so we finally made it to Midway Island, and I spent 3 or 4 days there while they were flying out the new engines, installing the engines. Japan, we'd usually lay over for 2 or 3 days. The Philippines, the same. I made one flight to French Indochina. This was what later became Vietnam, but this was in the 50s when the French were still there fighting. And I stayed there, I think, 2 days.
Which island did you feel like had the most importance to you, or do you have any memories from any of the islands that you went to that weren't part of the United States, or just Hawaii?
Well, I spent more total time in Hawaii, and I'm more familiar. And when I say Hawaii, I only spent time on the island of Oahu, where Pearl Harbor is located, and where our landing field was located. And the other islands, I had a good high school friend, still a good friend, from high school, Paul Kostak, and he was stationed on Guam. And when I used to fly on my way to Japan, I would stop in Guam to rest, sleep, and Paul would always pick me up at the airplane in a bus and take me to the Quonset hut. So each place had its own unique charm. I used to enjoy Japan shopping and all the different things. The cultural differences are fascinating to study if you like to travel, and I like to travel.
You mentioned that you were a pilot. Did you have any?
No, I wasn't a pilot.
Oh, you weren't a pilot?
No, I worked when I wasn't flying as a parachute rigger, which, among other things, packing parachutes you could do, although I never made a jump with a parachute, so I could never sign that I packed a parachute. Parachute rigger specialist had to sign that. But we worked with all survival gear that was used in the squadron, and that was our main function. But I flew as an orderly, like a steward, or a, I don't know what we called him an orderly. So I was an enlisted man flying and basically looked after the cargo and the people on the plane, if we had any people. Sometimes we had just cargo. Most of the time we had some cargo and some people. And so it was always different every place we went.
What was the cargo on the planes, or what did you specifically pack in the survival packs?
Well, the survival, we had 4 large 20-man rubber life rafts that were suspended from the ceiling in the plane. And because we spent the vast majority of our time, maybe 99% of our flights were over water, usually over the Pacific. We were very survival orientated, so we carried different types of survival gear, but most of it was packed in those life rafts that were suspended, as I say, from the ceiling. The cargo was literally anything that had to go, and Admiral Byrd was a typical example. Who would have thought that he would have got all the way to New Zealand and then had all that large shopping list of things that he needed? So they said, we need 5 planes, and they filled them up, and we flew them to New Zealand. So just literally out the Aleutian chain, we would take dependents, wives, children, fresh vegetables. Oh, we always carried mail, so we were very, very popular wherever we landed, especially in the Pacific Islands, because we always brought the mail. So literally anything.
Did you have any memorable experiences either with mail or any of the cargo that you brought?
No. I'm thinking of the in Alaska. I don't know if you've ever flown in Alaska, but the weather can be very unpredictable. In fact, when our squadron started flying to Alaska, the common belief was that, and this was before I came in the squadron, the common belief was they would never make a go of flying out the Aleutian chain because the weather is so terrible. The wind blows all the time, and it's foggy, and most of the time when we would land on the island of Kodiak, you didn't see anything until the plane touched down the runway. And that's called ground control approach, where somebody on the ground talks you down using radar. And the pilots would have to come in blind, so to speak.
Did you receive any medals or decorations in your service?
Well, just kind of the ones you get for showing up. I was technically in the Korean service. I didn't get in any trouble for 4 years, so I got a good conduct medal and 4 or 5 others, but just basically the ones you get for showing up.
As today is Veterans Day, do you have any special reflections or traditions that you have on Veterans Day?
I do. Before the interview started, I showed you a picture of my father who was in the First World War, and a picture that was taken when he was in London during the war. And then my brother, Tom, was drafted into the Army, and I think in 1944, and he was, after he was trained, he was moving forward for the invasion of Japan. And he had gotten to Hawaii, and they were, I don't know how much history you've studied, but our government was moving troops forward into New Zealand and other places to get ready for the major invasion until they dropped the atomic bomb. So, we've had a history. None of my sons have ever been in the military, but before that, there's been a history in the family, and so that's, Armistice Day means maybe more to me when I remember my father than a lot of people.
You mentioned your family. Was it easy to stay in touch with your family when you were delivering mail or when you were flying to different islands?
Yes, just the normal way. It was impractical to phone all the time, so I didn't phone, but I would write home regularly, and you can keep up with the newspapers. I didn't hear anything from them, of course, when I was flying to Japan or the Philippines or Alaska, but when I came back to the base, I was out on one flight and I came back and there had been horrific tornado in Flint, Michigan, which was my home. And so everybody in the squadron, was on all the news, but of course it wasn't on the news in Japan. So they were all advising me that maybe I should call home and whatever. But
how did people entertain themselves either abroad in Japan or when you were at home in Hawaii?
well, my duty station was really in California. That's where I got my mail and what have you. And so that was my home base in California. And there was a lady who I remember very fondly in my memory bank, who, an older lady, and she was in Menlo Park, California. That's near Stanford University. And she got together with some of the local people and the merchants, and they put together a USO. It was an organization similar to the USO that you see at O'Hare Airport and other places. And she put together, rented a building, and she had a servicemen's club that was just on her own. And she provided refreshments and music and hostesses, and it was a great place to go, especially if you were not interested in going out to the bars and doing all those other things. And she played a very important role in my life and in the lives of a lot of the servicemen that were in that area when I was there in the 1950s.
And this was in California, you said?
This was in Menlo Park, California, which is south of San Francisco. And what I would do if I was in the States is I would finish my work, eat dinner, and then maybe take a nap, and then put on my uniform, dress uniform, go outside the gate, take my dress uniform off, put on civilian clothes, and then hitchhike 10 miles to this servicemen's center. And then at the end of the evening, you would hitchhike back, and because you had to go in and out of the base always in uniform. So outside the uniform, they had a special building with lockers, and so that's how we had to play the game.
Do you vividly remember the day that your service ended when you were discharged?
Pretty much. I had befriended this fellow in the Navy, and he was going home on leave when I was getting discharged. He hadn't served his 4 years yet. And he was from Cody, Wyoming, and I had never been to the mountains. And I had purchased 6 months before my discharge a little Volkswagen Beetle. And I drove that. As soon as I got discharged and they stamped all the papers and gave me the money and, okay, now you're free to go, we got in the car and we drove nonstop to his ranch in Wyoming. And so that, and he introduced me to Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone Park and all of the sites. And then for the next 2 summers, while I was a college student, I worked as a guide in Yellowstone National Park. So it was an important day for me. He introduced me to the West, let's say, the mountains.
Where did you go to school after you were discharged?
I went to the University of Michigan, in Flint, Michigan.
Oh, okay.
Because the University of Michigan has like many of the universities do now, there's the Purdue Extension in, I guess, I forget, around Gary or someplace, but they have, so the University of Michigan, there was a very wealthy philanthropist in Flint, Michigan, Charles Stewart Mott, and he told the University of Michigan, if you will send professors, I will build you a building and equip it. So that's how it got there.
Do you still have many friendships or relationships that you had in the service? It seems like you have the friend in Wyoming. Did you have any others?
He's since deceased, but I think that's pretty much, I lost contact. Shortly after I was discharged, they disbanded the squadron. So the entity as such wasn't there on a continuing basis. But mostly it's Cecil, and then a few of the friends that we had in common who would come out to the ranch and go hunting or what have you.
Did you see a big difference in Flint, Michigan, or the United States as a whole since you left for service and then coming back? It seems like you spent some time in California, but did you see much change in Flint, Michigan, or any other places that you grew up?
We have a family joke in our family. When I went in the Navy, my folks lived at one place, and when I came home from the Navy, they had moved. And I always joke and say, they didn't tell me the address, but of course they did. But it was different, and the major reason it was different is that I was different. I was 4 years older. I had spent 4 years literally almost living on an airplane, flying all the time. And in our squadron, some of the men who were eligible for flight status wanted to fly. I was one. Some of the friends, like my friend Cecil in Wyoming, he was married. He didn't want to fly much, but he got his flight pay anyhow, and I was making $75 a month, and my flight pay was $75 a month extra, so it was very important. But some would fly more and some would fly less, and I chose to fly more.
Have you joined a veterans organization since you've been discharged?
I'm a member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars.
What did you do with either the degree that you got from your university as a career after being discharged?
Well, I never got a degree because I had about 90-some credit hours, and somebody came as a result of a friend who I worked for at the Flint Journal. He offered me a job at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, and I looked around at some of my friends who were still going to college, and they were hoping to get a job when they got out, and this fellow was saying, here's a job. So I checked out of my classes, and I became a full-time employee, and then went back and started going to school in the evenings until I finally got another job offer, and I moved to Detroit. And then I had an opportunity to continue to get my degree, keep moving towards a degree, or study and get another degree, a Chartered Life Underwriter degree, which is an insurance degree. And the people I trusted said, what do you want to spend time on the college degree for? Everybody's going to assume in business that you already have that. You should do this. So I did, and it was another good decision.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about the war, the military in general? It seems like your family had a military history, but has your service changed that or reinforced that in any way?
Well, being a student of history, I was very upset as an individual to find out that, I don't know if you know this, if you studied this, and as you looked at the Korean police action. Now they're calling it a war. It wasn't really a war. But if you look at the Korean conflict, you find, and many of my high school friends were over there, and some of them were wounded pretty severely. We started the war at the 38th parallel. We fought for 3 years. 50,000 men died. And you know where we ended up?
38th parallel.
The same place. Okay. So that always bothered me, and I thought about it a lot. And then one day, through a book, a friend gave me a book, and the book told me that at the time of the Korean conflict, the supreme commander over all of the forces, not just the United States forces, but all of the forces, was the Undersecretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs. And by agreement at the founding meeting of the United Nations, this individual was always to be a Russian communist general. So all of the battle plans of our forces had to be approved by a Russian communist general, except one. the landing at Incheon, which MacArthur put together a whole army at sea and didn't notify all the right people. And for that, he was fired. But that upset me greatly when I used to see, we'd land at Midway sometime in my earlier flight, and the planes would come in, these big hospital planes full of wounded. That made an impression on me. And then when I found out that they were just for nothing, yeah, that upset me.
Is there anything else that you would like to add that we've not covered in the interview so far?
Well, no, just I enjoyed, I've told many of my friends that I was one of the lucky ones. I spent 4 years in the Navy, and I consider it my pre-retirement leave. The best food I've ever eaten in my life, before or since, was when I was in the Navy. Consistently. I've had some bad meals. You know, you go to Guam and you eat eggs that were, the carton is stapled, stored in cold storage in some mountain in Denver, Colorado, or someplace around there. And, you know, and they're cracking them open and they don't smell too good. And I've eaten some bad things, but generally it was very, very a good experience. I tried to, you know, you've probably heard the old saying, if you're dealt lemons, you know, maybe you can make lemonade. Well, I always felt, like you probably do in school, you know, you have a good day and you have a bad day. And you make the best of it as best you can. And that's what I did, and I was very fortunate and had a lot of good times. And I had good experiences with great people in New Zealand, in Japan, Alaska, a lot of places I went. And then one Christmas, are you familiar? Bob Hope used to take Hollywood stars to the forward areas and give concerts and what have you at Christmas time. I was in the crew that did that one year to Alaska. And we had a number of young Hollywood starlets and stars, and they went around, we flew them all over Alaska, putting on these shows for the service people, and it was interesting to meet them and see how they, you know, they gave up their Christmas, they had no compensation, they just volunteered. And when we went to Burbank to pick up our passengers, there were 10 planes lined up in a row, going to all different places in the world, wherever there was military. And so that impressed me. There's a lot of funny people in Hollywood. I mean, funny, not funny. But there's a lot of great people there also that are very generous, and I appreciated the time I spent with them.
Very glad to hear that.
Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.